Alright, so I promised that I would do a live book reading. I tried to find something appropriate. You know, I don't want Facebook to get mad at me. Got a lot of random novels. So I picked Harry Potter. So we're going to read Harry Potter tonight. Let's see, is anybody watching yet? I have no idea. Haha! I have one spectator. Just one. That's fine. So we're going to start with chapter 1, obviously. I haven't read Harry Potter in a very long time. Oh, now I have 2! I have 2 people watching me drink water. Oh, now I have 3! And 4. Oh god, I'm going to start to get nervous. Okay, let's do this. I have to get comfy. Yes, I have a stuffed unicorn. Don't judge me. I'm 30 years old with stuffed animals. Okay. Aw, I miss you too. I'll come up there and visit sometime. Maybe next time we won't have nearly as much alcohol, and I'm not going to promise I won't tickle you, because that's gonna happen, Franklin. Alright, so chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Stop judging me, Angie. It's Angela Cordero. Okay. Are we ready? Can I start reading this now? Or do I need to wait and see any other comments coming my way? Is Manny watching, Angie? I'm waiting. Oh, I love you too. Okay, now I'm gonna read you Harry Potter. Now I'm down to 3 people watching. I guess nobody's really that interested in Harry Potter book time, huh? Okay, you ready? Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, and they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they'd never seen him. The boy was also another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she rustled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got in his car and backed out of number 4's drive. I'm gonna look to see. Oh, I guess I'll come here and wave at all of you people watching. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. Okay. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, it was looking at the sign. Cats don't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But at the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on the huddle of these weirdos standing close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived at the Grunnings parking lot, his mind back on drills. Aw, and Mom's joined. Oh, and Chelsea. Hi, Chelsea. Okay. The book is a lot different from the movie. There's a lot more stuff in the book than there is in the movie, so we're only going to read chapter 1 tonight. I'll do it again. All right. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills this morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, but he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut bag in hand, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters! That's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he's just being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were a lot of people called Potter, who also had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It must have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He couldn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Jason, why do you have to be drunk to listen to Harry Potter? That's horrible. There's children listening to this. Sheesh. All right. So Mr. Dursley just walked into someone. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset about being knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made most passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted at the spot. He'd been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he'd been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner about how Mrs. Nextdoor's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went to the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping patterns. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGriffin with the weather. Gonna be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting strangely today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. People have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. This is a drinking game now? Nice, Justin. Alright, I'll brush my hair. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars. There are a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said as casually as he could, Their son, he'd be Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, is it? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley went in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought of them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. Oh, how very wrong he was. Okay. I'm sorry, I took a second to read the comments, everybody. And I need a drink of water, hang on. I'm still going. The story isn't over. This is only the first chapter. I'm not reading the whole book tonight, because good grief. We'll do this again tomorrow. Okay. So the Dursleys are in bed. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he'd just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak looking for something, but he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, who was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open and held it up in the air and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put outer, until the only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their windows now, only beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley. Even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't have been able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the putter-outer back into his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment, he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings the cat had had on its own eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun, and she looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "Dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly. "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? What, when you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everybody's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I bet that was Diddless Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably. "But that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless, out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp, sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. "A fine thing it would be if, on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out all about us." "I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore?" "It certainly seems so," says Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. They're a kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was a moment for lemon drops. "As I say, even if you-know-who has gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who's nonsense. For 11 years I've been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name. Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched. But Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice. "It all gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name." "I know you haven't," said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you know who, all right, Voldemort, was frightened of." "You flatter me," says Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort has powers I could never have." "Only because you're too, well, noble to use them." "It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs." Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying? About why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him?" It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day, for neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. "What they're saying," she pressed on, "is that night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter are that they're dead." Professor Dumbledore, bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. "Lily and James? I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus." Professor Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. I'm actually tearing up a little bit over here, guys. Oh my goodness. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. "That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true? Faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy? It's just astonishing, all of the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? Oh my god! Are you really drinking to this? Oh my goodness! We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch out of his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands, but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I came to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You don't mean, you can't mean, the people who live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't! I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people any less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here? It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain all of this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in the world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it in? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth and changed her mind. Swallowing, and said, Yes, you're right, of course, but how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound broke the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky. A huge motorcycle fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing compared to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face, and his hands the size of trash can lids and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast, muscular arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. "Hagrid," said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. "At last. And where did you get that motorcycle?" "Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir," said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. "Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir." "No problems, were there?" "No, sir. The house was almost destroyed. But I got him out all right before the muggles started swarming round. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol." Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet black hair over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a bolt of lightning. "Is that where?" whispered Professor McGonagall. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "He'll have that scar forever." "Can't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" "Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself above my left ankle. It is a perfect map of the London Underground." "Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir?" asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. And then suddenly, Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. "You'll wake the muggles." "Sorry," sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. "But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with muggles." Yes, it's very sad, but get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found," Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep and took a letter out of his cloak and tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling lights that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations." "Yeah," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "I'll be taking Sirius's bike back. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Dumbledore swung himself onto the motorcycle, kicked the engine to life, and with a roar it rose into the sky and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding at her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out the silver putter-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back to the street lamps so that Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he mumbled. He turned on his heel, and with a swoosh of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky, the very last place you would expect anything astonishing to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment, people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." All right, how was that? Do I need to read chapter 2? Does anybody want to hear chapter 2? I saw that I kept going down to like 3 people. I know Angie's watching. Angie and Manny, do you guys want me to read chapter 2? Chelsea, do you want me to read it? Alex? I need some input here. I will read chapter 2. I'll keep going. I like reading. You guys know this, or at least people who know me know this. Are you telling me that me reading you Harry Potter? Okay, Tanner, you want me to read the next? No. Alex, then go away. Okay, so Tanner wants me to read more. Manny wants me to read more. Hey ho to you too, Sarah. I'll read more. Hi, Elena. All right. I will read chapter 2. Let me grab another drink of water and cozy up under my blankets here because it got chilly. I don't know why it got so chilly. So how are the voices? Do the voices sound good? I'm like trying to give everybody their own special voice through this. I don't know what Harry Potter's going to sound like, but we'll find out soon. Oh, hi, Mama. I didn't even know you were on here. My grandmother's watching too. That's awesome. Okay. All right. Clear my throat. Don't worry. It's not the corona. Social distancing at its finest. Every time I brush my hair, there's people taking drinks. I'm glad to know I'm a drinking game. It's fun. I found a frog. Hey, Mama. I'm reading with a unicorn too. All right, you ready? Chapter 2. A nice big old fat Dudley with all his presents. Ugh. The Vanishing Glass. Thank you, Tanner. I'm glad you think I'm doing good. I appreciate that. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front steps. But Privet Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front garden and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been the night before Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago, there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing different colored bonnets. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby. The photographs now showed a large blonde boy riding his first bicycle, on a carousel at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room held no sign at all that another boy lived in the house too. Yet Harry Potter was still there, asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice that made the first noise of the day. Up! Get up! Now! Harry woke with a start. His aunt rapped on the door again. Up! She screeched. Harry heard her walking towards the kitchen, and then the sound of a frying pan being put on the stove. He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he'd been having. It was a good one. There had been a flying motorcycle in it. He had a funny feeling he'd had the same dream before. His aunt was back outside the door. Are you up yet? She demanded. Nearly, said Harry. Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect on Dudley's birthday. Harry groaned. What did you say? His aunt snapped through the door. Nothing, nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could he have forgotten? Harry got slowly out of bed and started looking for socks. Oh, I'm glad you and Sherry are enjoying it. He found a pair under his bed, and after pulling a spider off them, he put them on. Harry was used to spiders, because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them. And that's where he slept. When he was dressed, he went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath all of Dudley's birthday presents. It looked as though Dudley had gotten the new computer he wanted, not to mention the second television and the racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise. Unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favorite punching bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard. But Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was, because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobby knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of Scotch tape because of all the times Dudley had punched him in the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a lightning bolt. He had had it as long as he could remember. The first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it. "In the car crash when your parents died," she said. "And don't ask questions." Don't ask questions. That was the first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. "Comb your hair," he barked, by way of a morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted that Harry needed a haircut. Harry must have had more haircuts than the rest of the boys in his class put together, but it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much neck, and small, watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly over his thick, fat forehead. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said that Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. 36, he said, looking at his mother and father. "That's 2 less than last year." "Darling, you haven't counted Aunt Margie's present yet. See, it's under this big one from Mommy and Daddy." "All right, 37 then," said Dudley, going red in the face. Harry could see a huge Dudley tantrum coming on. Began wolfing down his bacon as soon as possible in case Dudley turned the table over. Aunt Petunia obviously sensed danger too, because she said quickly, and we'll buy you another 2 presents while we're out today. How's that, Pumpkin? 2 more presents. Is that all right?" Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally, he said, "So then I'll have 39 sweetums," said Aunt Petunia. "Oh," said Dudley, sitting down heavily and grabbing the nearest parcel. "All right, then." Uncle Vernon chuckled. "Little Tyke wants his money's worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley." He ruffled Dudley's hair. At that moment, the telephone rang, and Aunt Petunia went to answer it while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unwrap the racing bike, a video camera, a remote-controlled airplane, 16 new computer games, and a VCR. Holy shit, a VCR. That's so weird to think about. Oh my goodness. Man, how old is this book? He was ripping the paper off a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone, looking both angry and worried. "Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Miss Figg's broken her leg. She can't take him." She jerked her head in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day to adventure parks, hamburger restaurants, or the movies. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Figg, a mad old lady who lived 2 streets over. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Mrs. Figg made him look at photographs of all the cats she'd ever owned. "Now what?" said Petunia, looking furiously at Harry as though he'd planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Figg had broken her leg, but it wasn't easy when he reminded himself it would be a whole year before he had to look at Tibbles, Snowy, Mr. Paws, or Tufty again. "We could phone Marge," Uncle Vernon suggested. Don't be silly, Vernon. She hates the boy. The Dursleys often spoke about Harry like this, as though he wasn't there, or rather, as though he was something very nasty that they couldn't understand them, like a slug. Oh, what about, what's her name, your friend, Yvonne, on vacation in Majorca, snapped Miss Aunt Petunia. You could just leave me here, Harry said hopefully. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on television for a change, and maybe even have a go on Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked as though she'd just swallowed a lemon. And come back and find the house in ruins, she snarled. I won't blow up the house, said Harry, but they weren't listening. I suppose we could take him to the zoo, said Aunt Petunia slowly, and leave him in the car. The car's new. He's not sitting in it alone. Dudley began to cry loudly. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It'd been years since he'd really cried. But he knew that if he screwed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted. Oh, Dinky Duddiums, don't cry. Mommy won't let him spoil your special day, she cried, flinging her arms around him. I don't want him to come, Dudley yelled between large pretend sobs. He always spoils everything. He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gap in his mother's arms. Just then, the doorbell rang. Oh, good Lord, they're here, said Aunt Petunia frantically, and a moment later, Dudley's best friend, Piers Polkiss, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their backs while Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Harry, who couldn't believe his luck, was sitting in the back of the Dursleys' car with Piers and Dudley on the way to the zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with him, but before they'd left, Uncle Vernon had taken Harry aside. I'm warning you, he said, putting his large purple face as close to Harry's as he could. I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now until Christmas. I'm not gonna do anything, said Harry. Honestly. But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was, strange things often happened around Harry, and it was just no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short he was almost bald except for his bangs, which she left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day, where he was already laughed at for his baggy clothes and taped glasses. The next morning, however, he'd gotten up to find his hair exactly as it had been before. He had been given a week in his cupboard for this, even though he tried to explain that he couldn't explain how it had grown back so quickly. Good grief, sorry. Fuzzy hair. Another time, Aunt Petunia had been trying to force him into a revolting old sweater of Dudley's, brown with orange puffballs. The harder she tried to pull it over his head, the smaller it seemed to become, until finally it might have fit as a hand puppet, but certainly wouldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia had decided it must have shrunk in the wash, and to his great relief, Harry wasn't punished. On the other hand, he'd gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the old school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him, as usual, when, as much to Harry's surprise as anyone else's, there he was, sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys had received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress telling them Harry had been climbing school buildings. But all he tried to do, as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked door of his cupboard, was jump behind the big trash cans outside the kitchen doors. Harry supposed the wind must have caught him mid-jump. But today, nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being between Dudley and Pierce to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't school, his cupboard, or Mrs. Fig's cabbage-smelling living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry. Oh, hang on, guys. I need to go grab my cell phone charger real quick. We're at 20%. I'll be back. We're going to continue reading Harry Potter. Give me a moment. I'm working on it. I have to put my charger back in. Recharging. Hang on. We're going to turn this right side up. Oh, I can't turn my phone while recording. Well, let's hope that it's charging. It should be. Alright, now I gotta get comfy again. Alright, any more comments since I've been... Oh, people watching. Okay. Alright, sorry, I gotta put my hair back down away from my ears because, okay guys, there's a drinking game going on, apparently. When I brush my hair, you have to take a drink. I don't even know if he's still watching. I have no idea who's watching currently, besides Angie and Manny. Alright, where were we? Ah, yes. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank, and Harry were just a few of his favorite subjects. This morning it was motorcycles. Roaring along like maniacs, the young hoodlums, he said, as a motorcycle overtook them. I had a dream about a motorcycle, said Harry, remembering suddenly. It was flying. Uncle Vernon nearly crashed into the car in front of him. He turned around in his seat and yelled at Harry, his face like a gigantic beet with a mustache. Motorcycles don't fly! Dudley and Piers snickered. I know they don't, said Harry. It was only a dream. But he wished he hadn't said anything. If there was one thing that Dursleys hated even more than his asking questions, it was his talking about anything acting in a way that it shouldn't. No matter if it was in a dream or even a cartoon, they seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas. It was a very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys bought Dudley and Piers large chocolate ice creams at the entrance, and then, because the smiling lady in the van had asked Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him along, they bought him a cheap lemon ice pop. It wasn't bad either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched a gorilla scratching its head, who looked remarkably like Dudley, except that it wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he'd had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little ways apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Piers, who were starting to get bored by the animals, wouldn't fall back into their favorite hobby of hitting him. They ate at the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because his Knickerbocker glory didn't have enough ice cream on top, Uncle Vernon bought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt, afterward, that he should have known it was too good to last. After lunch, they went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Piers wanted to see huge poisonous cobras and thick man-eating pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a trash can. But at that moment, it didn't look in the mood. In fact, it was fast asleep. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. "Make it move!" he whined at his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. "Do it again!" Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. It just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned. He shuffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it had died of boredom itself. No company except stupid humans drubbing their fingers on the glass, trying to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having a cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitors were Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake him up. I mean, at least he got to visit the rest of the house, though. The snake suddenly opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on a level with Harry's. It winked. Harry stared. Then he looked quietly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head towards Uncle Vernon and Dudley, then raised its eyes to the ceiling. It gave Harry a look that said quite plainly, "I get that all the time." Just 2 chapters.
What chapter you on?
I'm on chapter 2. Do you want to come listen now?
Nah, not really.
Sorry, Damon came in the room. Okay, well then you and Freya scoot out then.
Okay. Right.
Go on, Freya. Good girl. Close the door, baby. Damon doesn't want to listen to Harry Potter. I think he's listened to it enough in his life. We've read this book a few times. Alright. So the snake, is talking to Harry. "I know," Harry mumbled through the glass, though he wasn't sure the snake could hear him. "It must be really annoying." The snake nodded vigorously. "Where do you come from, anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at the little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. "Boa constrictor, Brazil." "Huh. Was it nice there?" The boa constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry read on. "This specimen was bred in the zoo." "Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil." As the snake shook its head, a deafening shout behind Harry made both of them jump. "Dudley! Mr. Dursley! Come and look at this snake! You won't believe what it's doing!" Dudley came waddling toward them as fast as he could. "Out of the way, you!" And he punched Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell on the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast that no one saw how it happened. 1 second, Piers and Dudley were leaning right up close to the glass, and the next, they leapt back with howls of horror. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass in front of the boa constrictor's tank had vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exits. As the snake slid swiftly past them, Harry could have sworn a low, hissed voice said, "Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo." The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. "But the glass," he kept saying. "Where did the glass go?" The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong, sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. Piers and Dudley could only gibber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at their heels as it passed. But by the time they were all back at Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them about how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Piers was swearing it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, was Piers calming down enough to say, "Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry?" Uncle Vernon waited until Piers was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Go! Cupboard! Stay! No meals!" before he collapsed into a chair. Aunt Petunia had to run and get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard much later, wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was. He couldn't be sure that the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking to the kitchen for some food. He'd lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years. 10 miserable years. As long as he could remember. Ever since he'd been a baby and his parents had died in that car crash. He couldn't remember being in a car when his parents had died. Sometimes when he strained after long hours in his cupboard, he came up with a strange vision. A blinding flash of green light, a burning pain on his forehead. Then he supposed was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where all that green light came from. He couldn't remember his parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he'd been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed of some unknown relation coming to take him away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were his only family. Yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, that strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a velvet top hat had bowed to him once while they were out shopping. After asking Harry furiously if he'd known the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking old woman dressed all in green had waved merrily at him once on a bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat had actually shaken his hand in the street the other day and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about all these people was the way they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to get a closer look. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated the odd Harry Potter in his baggy old clothes and broken glasses. And nobody liked to disagree with Dudley's gang. Okay, I've read 2 chapters. Am I good now? I'll wave at people. I mean, I have nothing better to do. I can read another chapter if you want me to. Or I'll just stare at all of you. This is fun. Thank you. So we're done? We're good? We're good at 2 chapters and we'll do this again in a couple days? Maybe I'll do it again Saturday night. Saturday at around the same time. So 5 p.m. my time. The Last of the Mohegans. Really? Is your father listening to this too? Did your whole family sit down to listen to me read a book? Seriously? Awesome, Tanner. All right, so Saturday, 5 p.m. our time here in Illinois. Angie, that's 6 p.m. for you. Hi, Angel. You missed it. I just read 2 chapters of Harry Potter. All right. I'm going to end this live thing now. Thank you guys for watching. I really hope that Justin didn't get too drunk with all my hair swishes. I wasn't intending to become a drinking game. Not acceptable? What's not acceptable? To read it again on Saturday night? Is Saturday night not going to work for you? I'll make it an event. I've just read the first Harry Potter. You should definitely go back and watch the whole thing with the kiddos. I promise it's child appropriate. My best friend's on here with her kid and apparently the whole family. I tried to do voices and everything. I probably should have pulled out the British accent, but I didn't feel like doing it. I just kind of read and just let it flow. I always feel weird when I'm doing this. Like, I'm waiting for you guys to respond and write something. I feel like I'm talking to myself. I do that regularly, but, you know. I love you too, Angie. I'm glad you enjoyed it. So Saturday night, we'll do this again. We will read chapter 3, The Letters from No One. We all know what happens then, don't we? At least anybody who's read the book. Lily will get a kick out of watching me read this, Angel. I'm gonna, when I finish this video, hand her your phone or your tablet or whatever and have her watch it from the beginning. I think it's roughly an hour long. I think I've been on here for about an hour now. But it's quite amusing, I promise. And Lily has a pretty good sense of humor, so she would definitely enjoy it. Yes, you are. I mean, I can read chapter 3. If people want me to read chapter 3, I can read chapter 3. I don't mind, or we can wait. And shut up, iPhones don't suck. You know what does suck is the fact that I live in the middle of nowhere and I don't have internet, so we're relying upon my phone's data. Okay? Alright, I'm getting off here. I'm not going to read chapter 3 tonight. I will read chapter 3 and chapter 4 on Saturday night. So Saturday night, 5 p.m., moms grab your wine or whatever, kids grab your juice boxes, sit down, grab your iPad, cast me to your TV, I don't care. I will read a story to you. Maybe I'll find some way to make it more fun. We're going to read through this whole Harry Potter book. I will read live online until this quarantine thing ends. I pinky promise with myself. And the rest of you guys. Here you go. Alright. Bye! Have a good night! I can't wait to go back and read the rest of these comments that are on here because I have no idea. I was paying attention to my book. Alright. Bye, guys. Mwah.